Okay, so before this video truly begins, I just want to say that everything I'm going to say in this video is just my opinion. You might disagree with a lot of it, and that's totally fine. Just accept that I'm only making this video for fun and nothing else. After the release of Deltarune Chapters 3 and 4, we finally have been able to come into contact with the Roaring Knight themselves multiple times throughout the game. With an intimidating boss battle and multiple scary encounters, this villain definitely satisfies what I had originally wanted from the Knight. This is a character who has been speculated on for a long time, even since the release of Chapter 1, and now, about 7 years after the release of Deltarune's first chapter, we finally have a deep insight into the Knight's character. Or do we? You see, despite getting a whole battle with them and many tight encounters where we barely survive, we still hardly know much about who this character actually is, what their true motives are, and how this ties into the events of the game. This character doesn't even have a singular confirmed voice line. More on that later. That's why we will be discussing who the Roaring Knight is, why they're doing what they're doing, and how this will impact the story. Firstly, based off of the knight's appearance, they seem to be a tall, slender being with long antlers capable of shapeshifting. Hold on, back up. Antlers? This can only mean one thing. Remind me which family in Deltarune consists of people with antlers? That's right, the Holiday family. They are now absolutely the main focus when it comes to determining who the Roaring Knight truly is. However, I wouldn't take the antlers detail too seriously, as the Knight does seem to have a design based off of a couple other characters as well, so the antlers could technically just be a trait that's not based off of what the Knight actually looks like. Although I won't use this to support any theories that don't involve the Holidays as candidates. Some of the Knight's attacks also resemble snowflakes, as many fans have pointed out, and in their battle theme, Black Knife, many fans claim to hear the Lost Girl motif, which is tied heavily to the Holiday family and their missing daughter, December. This already would seem to narrow down the Knight candidate down a lot, but you also have to consider the fact that the Knight can shapeshift and the fact that they have holes in their hands. These are not typical Darkener abilities nor Lightener abilities or traits. This is what makes the Knight so special. They clearly seem to be in some sort of disguise, and they are possibly tied to Gaster in some way. This is all definitely speculative. With all this information out of the way, it seems like we should have a pretty good idea of who the Knight actually is, right? Well, let's take a look at some of the most likely available candidates, then discuss special cases that not a lot of fans have brought up. For each candidate, we will discuss the means they could possibly have to be the Knight, their potential motive for creating dark fountains, and their opportunity to do so. I will also be rearranging the characters based off how likely I think they are to be the Roaring Knight, from least likely to most likely. I will also be going over candidates that have very little supporters and are very unlikely, just so we can make the video a little more interesting and not just have it be about the Holidays as candidates like literally every other post Chapter 3 Knight video ever. Every candidate will also receive a score out of 10 for how likely I think they are to be the Knight, with some slight bias from how much I personally like them as candidates. Without further ado, let's take a look at the 9 total candidates I wrote about for this video. Also, there's a bonus theory at the end I would recommend sticking around. Okay, so I said I would be discussing 9 total candidates in this video. Well, that was a lie. Sort of. Well, this first character I want to discuss isn't technically a character like the others, and thus won't be a part of the main video. I still thought this possibility was worth mentioning. Not that I truly believe this or think it has much credit, but hear me out. What if the Knight is just the Knight? Crazy thought, I know, but think about it. What if the Knight is really just its own character and isn't secretly another character in disguise? There's not much going for this theory, as the Knight is clearly tied to multiple characters, and I'm not sure how it would fit into the narrative if the character was truly its own being. There are many possible interpretations of this. Perhaps it was created from Chris's imagination, or Gaster, or maybe it's Chris's knife? Just some food for thought. This isn't part of the main video, so this is technically not what I'm trying to focus on, so I won't be ranking this one on the same list like the main characters. Although, if I were to say how likely this is, I would give it a 3 out of 10. I'm not really sure how the Knight being a completely original character would strengthen the narrative, but please feel free to give me some ideas on how it would. Anyways, let's really begin with who I believe is the worst possible candidate to be the Knight, while still theoretically being possible. This is someone in the Holiday family, beginning with who I and almost everyone in the community believes is the least likely Holiday to be the Knight, Noelle. She'll be the first person on this list and my least favorite Knight candidate. Noelle has antlers, though they're not particularly large, and they stay the same exact size when she enters the Dark World in Chapter 2. Her appearance in Chapter 2 absolutely means she would have to be wearing some sort of dark disguise when entering Chris's house and the church. Well, not impossible, where would she get such a thing? I guess I shouldn't question it, but that doesn't make it more likely that she's the Knight. First of all, Noelle's personality in Chapter 2 is being quite afraid of everything, which is a huge contrast from the bold, daring, and boastful appearance of the Knight in Chapters 3 and 4. You could argue that the Dark World adventure in Chapter 2 changed her significantly, even in the normal route, influencing her motives as the Knight or potentially even causing her to become the Knight, meaning Kris or someone else made Fountains 1 and 2. But overall, Noelle seems like a pretty similar person to how she was before Chapter 2 ends. Now, in the Weird route, she changes her personality significantly and grows much stronger. However, if you played both the normal and the weird routes fully and fought the Knight in both routes, you will notice that the exact same fight plays out both times no matter what. This means that Noelle would have to be hiding her strength in the weird route. Or she's just not the Knight. In all honesty, it would hardly make any sense. Notice how during the night battle, both Susie and Rouse are completely knocked out by the Knight, while Kris is simply left kneeling. It would be very hard to believe that Noelle suddenly stopped caring about Susie in favor of some deal she made with Kris, her neighbor who she only got to know a little better recently, but has hardly talked to since they were both children. You'd think that if the Knight was Noelle, she would at least leave Susie kneeling too, along with Kris, though splitting Rouse would make more sense as she doesn't know him as well. She does mention in Chapter 4 how he looks strikingly similar to Asriel, so that would show how much he actually cares about him as to try to kill someone who looks like him. Something that also wouldn't make sense is how in Chapter 2, Queen says, the Knight has taken its leave. You could argue that she was covering for Noelle, as she does mention multiple times how Noelle is stronger than she appears, but Queen acts like she wants Noelle to become the new Knight. If Queen saw Noelle create a fountain, or attack Darkeners, that would make sense as to why she's trying to help her become stronger. But Noelle being the Knight makes so little sense anyway that it's hardly worth discussing. She still clearly cares about Susie and would never deliberately hurt her, like the Knight does and tries to do so many times. Not to mention, she is being scolded by her mother supposedly at the exact time the Church Dark Fountains are being created, meaning there's absolutely no way she could have been there to create them. If Noelle somehow snuck into the church to make them before she went to her house, that still doesn't explain how the Knight is in the Church Dark World and almost immediately after Kris and Susie enter. She would have had to escape from her mother or get off the hook really early to be able to do what she did. Now, let's talk about a potential motive, one that I will use for the whole Holiday family in general: finding Des. Des is, or at least was, Noelle's older sister, who she liked and looked up to, so it would make sense if she was desperately trying to find her missing sister who could potentially be alive. But the methods she goes through to do it are so questionable that for her to actually be the Knight would arguably be one of the most insane plot twists in all of video game history, and not in a good way. The only thing that could theoretically give her the upper hand on some other candidates on this list is how she's a Holiday, and her being the Knight would at least make a small amount of sense if Toby was able to pull it off, though it still wouldn't be that well done of a twist. But I will say once again that Noelle is definitely not the Knight. I will consume a bucket of snails if it actually is her. Please hold me to this. It'd be really funny if Noelle was actually the Knight. Anyways, I think Noelle deserves a 2.5 out of 10 for a score. This next candidate is very, very interesting. We know so little about Gaster and Deltarune, but many fans have speculated that he is heavily connected to the world of Deltarune, with him being the one controlling everything secretly behind the scenes, even potentially putting us, the player, into Kris's soul. While I absolutely agree that this seems incredibly important to the game in some way, do I think he's the Roaring Knight by extension? Absolutely not, and here's why. First of all, the Knight's appearance looks nothing like the common depictions of WD Gaster, aside from the holes in their hands, which is very peculiar. Toby Fox has never explicitly depicted Gaster as being the mystery man found in Undertale. However, it is quite likely that they are the same person, as it would not make much sense for him to throw away the fandom's expectations for what a character looks like, when everyone has already had the same idea about Gaster for years. It's definitely not impossible, however, it would mean that the Knight's appearance is another certified fake-out, which we have seen a lot of in Deltarune recently. Though I think at this point it would be pretty annoying to lead the fandom towards the Holidays in many ways, only for the Knight to actually be Gaster. The Knight's laugh and smile do look vaguely similar to Gaster's smile, though I would not compare these directly. The Knight's torso and upper body can be compared to that of Papyrus as well, which many fans have pointed out jokingly. While we cannot say whether or not Papyrus and Gaster are related, we also cannot really use this as evidence to support the idea that Gaster is the Knight. We don't know the limits of Gaster's power though, so I could definitely see him being strong enough to be the Knight, having numerous possible motives for knighthood: experimentation, the desire to end the world, anything you can think of. He would also have any opportunity to create dark fountains in theory, as we have not seen him directly in the game yet, or so we think. Gaster is an extremely unpopular Knight candidate as of late, simply because he does not match the Knight's appearance as we know him. I truly believe that the Knight is being set up as one of the Holidays, so it actually being Gaster, while still being kinda cool, it really just feels like a scam with all the build-up we've had with the Holidays and other characters potentially, and it would also be an unnecessary fake-out to me. Also, if the voice in the intro and at our death is also Gaster, then that means the Knight themselves is constantly giving you the chance to retry the fight against them, even strongly encouraging you when you die to make it to their final attack and then die. It seems quite strange to me. However, this would also mean that Kris has been in cahoots with Gaster, the big bad, the whole time. While not completely unexpected, it would feel painfully close to the average fan theory, and that is why I do not support this theory. But I had to talk about it simply because their appearance matches Gaster ever so slightly, and we don't definitively know what Gaster looks like. We're only 99.9999% sure. Finally, I can be done talking about this. Gaster is definitely not the knight for the record, and I will still absolutely eat a bucket of snails if he actually is. Actually, I genuinely do wonder what they taste like. I wonder if there's a store close to me that sells them. As far as the score goes, I think he's actually slightly more likely to be the knight than Noelle, but not by much. 3 out of 10. Our next candidate is none other than the man himself. He's the brother of Sans. You know him, you love him, Papyrus. Wait a minute, Papyrus? Why is he on this list? Do I really think he has any credit going towards being the knight at all? Well, no. But I have seen people discuss this as being a possibility, surprisingly, so I decided to include him in the video. Although, believe me, guys, Papyrus is not the knight, and I personally don't think this would be a very good outcome for the narrative, besides being a funny twist that actually diminishes who the knight is as a character. Let's talk about him anyways, though, just because no one else will. As far as means, Papyrus definitely matches the physique of the knight, having slender limbs and an almost identical chest and torso. However, I wouldn't take this too literally, similar to the antlers detail I discussed earlier. He's arguably strong enough to do anything the knight does, especially when considering that his power is amplified in the Dark World, and we haven't even seen him in the game yet, although he most definitely is in the game. And therefore, he would be able to create fountains without limitation if he really was the knight. As far as motive goes, this is where the theory falls apart. Papyrus in Undertale was a kind, caring man who always saw the absolute best in others and wanted to provide a better future for anyone he could, while also being a relatively light-hearted guy, except towards Sans, of course, although the brothers still have a good relationship. The knight, however, comes off as a snarky but also serious brute who has a plan to destroy the world. I don't know anything about anyone else, but I just couldn't see Papyrus wanting to be that kind of guy. Although we do know that he is manipulable, when looking at what Flowey did to him in Undertale, he's not stupid by any means. So if he was truly manipulated by someone like Carol Holiday, for example, you think he'd be smart enough not to carry out plans that are very clearly dangerous? And since Papyrus is new in town, a potential motive would make even less sense for him. As far as the Knight's mutual relationship with Kris goes, if Kris really did know Papyrus despite Sans' encouragement to meet him, that would be pretty ironic, but also sort of a lame twist, as there are just a decent number of candidates that are just better. I guess it is technically worth mentioning that the Knight's sword tunnel attacks are similar to that of Sans and therefore Papyrus by extension. Never mind what I just said, that was pretty stupid. Overall, this seems like the kind of theory that's just a joke for most people, but I have seen others who are actually serious about this theory, betting all their money on an extremely slim chance, essentially. While it is technically possible for Papyrus to be the knight, I really can't see this being the case at all, and I would strongly encourage its supporters to invest more effort into a theory that has way more going for it. Still, though, this theory would be pretty funny, so I'll eat a bucket of snails if Papyrus is the knight. They can't be that bad, okay? Literally, the only reason I put Papyrus higher on the list than both Gaster and Noelle is because his physique actually does match the Knight's pretty well, but he's still not a very good Knight candidate. 3.5 out of 10. The next candidate is none other than Undertale's Prince of the Underground, Asriel Dreemurr. This candidate has actually been discussed less than Papyrus. However, this is surprisingly one that I'm not actually opposed to as much as some other candidates on this list, and I think that, given the right circumstances, this could technically work, although I will say that I don't truly believe this as a good possibility, and simply want to discuss it since the candidate technically exists. As far as means, we don't know what adult Asriel looks like, but there's really two directions this could go in. If he looks anything like Ralsei does, then he would not match the physical appearance of the knight at all. However, if he were to look anything like the god of hyperdeath Asriel from Undertale, or if he had a more adult-like appearance in general, then they could totally pass for the knight physically. Especially when considering his strength in Undertale as a final boss, he would be very strong in the Dark World. It is also worth mentioning that, during the knight's final boss fight, some of the attacks vaguely resemble Asriel's attacks, such as the final star attack and any of the attacks with swords, as both Asriel and the knight have the ability to make them appear at will. As far as opportunity goes, this is where the theory gets pretty weak, as Asriel is supposed to be at college still for all we know. It is almost time for his fall break, and he's returning presumably at the day at the festival at the earliest, or perhaps the day after, so if he had somehow managed to get back to hometown to be the Roaring Knight, he would have had to leave school a week or so early, and also, he would have had to not be noticed by anyone in town. As far as the Knight's relationship with Kris goes, this would work very well, as Kris has a very good relationship with the Asriel siblings. Kris even chats with them via text regularly, as he did until the internet suspiciously went down and is still down? Seriously, why hasn't this been mentioned past chapter 2? Anyways, why would Asriel want to be the Roaring Knight? He's shown to be a pretty nice, popular guy, so it's hard to find a valid reason why he would take on a snarky, animalistic personality like the Knights and go around making a bunch of dark fountains, even if it meant doing it with Kris. Religious motives? Perhaps. He was always known to be a pretty religious guy, arguably even more religious than Toriel, as he would often confess for the sins of Kris while they were playing video games together, despite the concept of sin not existing in the Deltarune religion. If you thought that being the knight would bring about a better world for Kris somehow, then that would make sense. But otherwise, I really can't see him being the knight unless Toby has been cooking up something beyond the imagining of even the most hardcore fans of his work. Also, not to mention, he was already the antagonist in Undertale, so there's really not much of a reason to make him the antagonist again, even if he were to be in a different form. Overall, the series is stronger than the other ones I've mentioned thus far, but it still doesn't really have that much going for it. I just don't think it's the worst thing ever. Still, though, pass the snails, please. 4.5 out of 10. Our next candidate is actually the father of the Holiday family, Rudy Holiday. While I do believe that Rudy is actually slightly more likely to be the knight than 4 other candidates on this list, it really isn't by too much, putting him in the middle spot. Rudy, of course, has antlers which are arguably large enough to match those of the knight. You could also absolutely use the argument that the disguise the knight wears invalidates arguments against the shapeshifting, and that's kind of fair. I would like to see some information on what this strange disguise is, though, and how Rudy got it if he really is the knight. Rudy's motive would, of course, be to find Des, his lost daughter. It would make for a perfect amount of sense to me if Rudy was just a heartbroken dad who went through desperate measures to accomplish a task that will benefit him and his family greatly, even if it meant hurting others in the process. I can absolutely see his wife, Carol, being in on the plan as well, along with Kris, as she does act incredibly strange in front of Kris, always welcoming them to her home and potentially calling them often. Rudy does seem to like Kris genuinely, so it would make sense if we went easy on Kris during the battle and stopped it when he realized that Kris and their friends were getting hurt too badly. However, where this liking of certain characters falls apart is once again with Susie, who gets swooned, despite the fact that Rudy clearly seems to like Susie at least a little, even encouraging her relationship with his daughter. To be fair though, Susie was pretty quick to act against the knight, so if Rudy felt like he had to knock her out in self-defense, that's for him to decide. That would actually make the line on screen really ironic if Rudy actually is the knight. All 3 Fun Gang members have been around Noelle at some point, so if Rudy felt like he had to beat them up to defend his daughter, that would be pretty funny. Now, let's get the elephant out of the room. Rudy is sick. Like, really sick. He's been staying in the hospital for an unknown amount of time, presumably with some sort of illness, which I personally interpret as lung cancer due to Rudy's frequent coughing. But that's not the argument here. If Rudy is bedridden, how would he be able to get up and make dark fountains? Well, we know from chapter 4 that Rudy does have the capability of walking and standing for a long period of time. He mentions how long the church service was for him, and yet he was able to stand the whole time and talk to Toriel, while also not cough a single time while attending the service. This could be interpreted as evidence that Rudy is getting better, or at least that he is really good at masking how he truly feels. In truth, we have no definitive proof that he is getting better or worse. However, we can speculate that if he got out of bed and walked for hours, he has the potential to create dark fountains. It should be noted that all of the locations for fountains are relatively close to the hospital, where Rudy is bedridden. Many fan theories also suggest that Kris skips over certain neighborhoods when walking through the town to remove unnecessary walking for the player, using the painting in the town hall as reference, of course. So it would make sense if Rudy did not want to take this route all the way to Kris's house, the one time in chapter 3 it being the one time he did have to go there. A lot of people would probably realize that he is out of bed at a time where he shouldn't be, which could arouse suspicion, so I'm not totally sure how credible this is. There's also the matter of Undyne being carried out of the house. If Rudy was the only one making the trip, you'd think it would be quite difficult for him to carry Undyne all the way to the bunker. He could have knocked her out to prevent her from resisting, but she likely still weighs a lot, which would be very difficult or impossible for Rudy to carry due to his medical condition, weakening him physically. It is also possible that Carol helped him take Undyne to the bunker as she is and on his plans. It is also possible that his friend Asgore is in on the plan, as he has a piece of the knight's weapon, the Black Shard, and references Rudy when speaking about his plan to win over Toriel and make the people at Hometown realize something important. It is possible that being in the Dark World is improving Rudy's condition, making him stronger, and giving him the ability to stand through the church service, or on the contrary, being the knight encased in a special body could be what's making him sick in the first place. I could see him being in the knight as a crazy plot twist, as he could still theoretically make fountains despite his condition and common location. However, I don't think that there is nearly as much evidence to support this theory as there is for the next few candidates. If Rudy is the knight, I will not eat a bucket of snails. I could at least theoretically see this being true, while the previous theories would absolutely blow me out of the water with how strange they would be. I'll give Rudy a 5 out of 10. The next candidate is someone you might not expect. I originally wasn't going to include the Kris Knight 2.0 theory because I wasn't sure if it had any credibility originally, not that many others on this list do anyways. And before the release of chapters 3 and 4, I was never a big supporter of the original Kris Knight theory anyway. It definitely had its credibility, but I was never more intrigued by it than other theories, so my expectations for Kris Knight 2 were pretty low, especially since we already see that Kris and the Knight are in fact different characters. But after watching the video by YouTuber Lukerfuffle on the new Knight theory for Kris, I do have to say that I found it to be quite interesting, and not in a bad way either. It's a pretty fun and harmless idea, and when put into practice, it actually kind of works. Well, maybe I shouldn't go that far with it, but I'll talk about it briefly. First of all, Kris and the Knight share an uncanny amount of physical similarities with their sprites. Many of their sprites, such as the turned around sprite with arms crossed and their pointing sprites, are quite similar, so it sort of checks out physically. Kris and the Knight are also similar-ish in personality, with both of them having that cocky teenager energy. As far as motive, I'd recommend you actually watch the video I'm talking about, which will be linked in the description, because I don't want to butcher the true message of the video. I will instead say that I found the theory to be quite interesting. While I'm not sure how this alternate version of Kris could have gotten to the timeline where the main game takes place, I think that the theory could work given the right circumstances, and I wouldn't even call it a bad theory like most of the other ones on this list. It just requires a lot of explanation and luck to be true. I do still think that it's worse than the original Kris Knight theory as far as credibility, as that one actually made a lot of sense in context of the game, but I still quite like this one, so I'll give it the highest score thus far, 5.5 out of 10. And now, with two candidates remaining, we have finally arrived at the good candidates. Carol Holiday is the mayor of Hometown, the mother of Des and Noelle, and the wife of Rudy. She's described by the citizens of Hometown as a strong willed woman who keeps a good track record. They also describe her as being incredibly busy, which would make sense if she was the roaring knight and went around creating dark fountains. Hometown is described by Undyne as a town where hardly anything interesting happens, which is why she sometimes causes crimes to happen just to have some fun and enjoy her job. So why would the mayor have so much to do unless she was going around doing roaring knight schemes? Carol's antlers fit in with those of the knights, and if she was the knight, the battle against her would make sense, as she does seem to like Kris, even telling them this in her own home. It would also make sense that she was immediately angry and cold at Susie due to the battle she had with her previously. She's also just an angry and cold person in general, so take that how you will. Now, let's take a look at the knight's weapon in detail. It appears to be some sort of pointed baseball bat at first, but then it seems to morph into a sword when it goes by the knight's side. Carol very distinctly owns two swords, including a katana, so she clearly would be the kind of person to own weapons capable of making dark fountains. However, one of the NPCs in the town hall claims that Carol often carries around a sword with her in her briefcase, which can easily be seen. However, when Carol enters the house, we see no such briefcase nor a sword. Keep in mind that the church dark fountains were likely being made during the time when Kris and Susie were over at Noelle's house before Carol arrived home. This means she would have needed to dispose of the sword somehow. Also, Carol was likely scolding Noelle at the time when Kris and Susie entered the church, so the lecture would have to be cut short for her to be in the dark world in time. Now, there's something strange we have to talk about. Some fans consider this damning evidence for Carol being the knight, but I can see multiple takes working for this. Kris gets multiple phone calls in Noelle's house from an unknown entity. They talk about dark fountains, Kris's soul, Susie touching the guitar, and when Kris tells him that Susie may find the code, they say, "I'll be right there." This is soon followed by Carol arriving at the house shortly, being home from work early. If Carol knows about fountains and Kris's soul, welcomes them to her home in red text, and reacts so strongly when she sees Susie, it's pretty obvious she's being set up as the knight, right? Well, after the reveal in Chapter 3 that Kris was not the Roaring Knight, after basically being told that that was the case multiple times, we know that Toby Fox is full of surprises, and it wouldn't be above him to make Carol the Knight a red herring. It definitely seems to me like that's what he's trying to tell us. However, you can interpret the calls Kris gets as technically being from someone else. Even the call where they say they'll be right there could be interpreted as the knight going to the church, as they were there immediately when Kris and Susie entered the dark world. Carol definitely seems like the type of person who would want to create dark fountains of event, possibly finding her daughter, and she doesn't seem like the best person morally, so I would not put it a buffer to hurt others if it meant fulfilling her goals. While Carol is a very likely candidate in my eyes, there is one more candidate who I'd like to discuss, the one who I believe is most likely the Roaring Knight. But as for Carol, I'll give her an 8 out of 10. She's pretty good, dang. December Holiday, also known as Des, is Noelle's older sister who is clearly missing from the game. It's likely that some strange event happened involving Kris, Des, and the town shelter, which caused Des to become lost in some form of darkness, or perhaps even in the code of the game. While she was clearly searched for by Asgore and his crew, it is possible that the search was called off early due to an unknown event, or Asgore ceased the search for Des entirely, showing that he believes she cannot be found, or he had given up hope. Some fan theories also suggest that Asgore may have accidentally killed Des with his truck, but I find this unlikely as Rudy and Carol do seem to care for him still. Either way, it resulted in Asgore's loss of his police job, his divorce with Toriel, and a barren financial situation for him where he barely gets by. It begs the question, if all these bad things happened to Asgore, what was the situation with Des, and where is she now, if anywhere? I believe that Des is the Roaring Knight. She was likely turned into the Roaring Knight by being pushed so far into some sort of layer of darkness that she lost a lot of her consciousness and parts of her moral compass, similar to a roaring titan, and she became a being that seeks the creation of dark fountains for unknown motives. No motive? Wouldn't that disprove the theory? Well, no, it's just something that we have not yet learned. I believe that Des was turned into the Roaring Knight involving the shelter, as we can clearly see a dark world inside of there at the end of chapter 3. Perhaps this created this fountain or someone else did, but I'm leaning towards Des as its creator due to the song Raise Up Your Bat. It seems very possible to me that Des wrote this song as the lyrics come follow me into the dark, with your heart is my mark, but shall guide you the way. I personally interpret this as Des telling Kris to follow her into the shelter's dark world, which she created, as Kris' human soul is shown in chapter 4 to have the ability to glow and guide the way for others. An unknown event involving this dark world caused Des to become the Roaring Knight, and it is quite likely that Kris feels guilty about what happened to Des, either with it being a deliberate cause of her disappearance, or their inactions leading to the terrible things that happened to her. Now, with the background out of the way, does Des match the Knight's appearance? Well, we wouldn't know, as we don't actually know what Des looks like. However, during the cutscene about the holidays with Tenna, we can tell that Des has antlers, and is most likely not a human like some fans previously thought. Anything goes for Des' behavior. However, we can tell that she recognizes Kris because she goes easier on them. Meanwhile, Susie and Ralsei are both swooned when hit by her too hard. There is also a moment towards the end of the battle where Kris coughs, perhaps signaling to her to end the battle early as not to hurt anyone too badly. Des isn't mindless, but she is perhaps heavily corrupted, being in some sort of strange deal with Kris. She could be the one on the phone in chapter 4, as at the end of the weird route we hear Carol calling Kris in a much less cryptic way, whereas the normal route call features the same entity on the phone from earlier, reminding Kris of their promise. The Knight's weapon, when first held up, largely resembles a baseball bat, and Des is known to have been very fond of baseball. She may even turn into a baseball at certain points to move around quickly and dodge attacks. It's all up to how you interpret her shapeshift ball. Besides the bat, Des also has knives stored in her room, so she's clearly capable of owning anything she might need to create dark fountains. To further the Knight's appearance, they hold the weapon in their left hand, although they do commit to throwing their attacks with their right hand, so this is a bit weird. In Des' room, you'll notice that the mousepad on her computer is on the left side, basically confirming that Des is left-handed at least somewhat. She might be ambidextrous, but this is unconfirmed. If we look at the other holidays, Carol grabs a guitar with Susie from her right hand and puts her right hand on Kris's shoulder as well. Rudy holds his fruit juice cup with his right hand in chapter 4, and Noelle is absolutely not the knight, so I shouldn't have to find an example where she's using a specific hand to do something. The left hand detail seems to be quite specific to Des and Deltarune. If Des actually is the knight, it is very likely that Carol knows about this as well, as it would explain the calls in chapter 4 and possibly give Des a way to have created the fountains. While Des quite likely created every fountain herself, except the one in chapter 3, obviously, it is possible that Kris and Carol have to make them for her in the light world, as she cannot enter the light world herself. This definitely needs more evidence, as you conclude that it simply has to be nighttime for Des to enter the light world, or she's simply invisible in the light world, similar to how the shadow crystals turn into clear glass when exposed to light. With her strength in her strange body, she would easily be able to carry Undone to the bunker, while the other night casts would have likely needed extra help, such as from Carol or Asgore, for example. Queen's description of the knight having long hands seems to imply that the knight did in fact create the cyberworld, as we can see on their sprite that their arms, and by extension their hands, are all very long. However you interpret the evidence, it all seems to me that Des is the most likely candidate to be the knight. While other people may know about this, such as Carol, Rudy, or even Father Alvin if you think about it, Des is possibly still doing most of the handiwork as the knight, such as imprisoning the three kings in chapter 1. If Des is the knight, I wouldn't be surprised at all, though I definitely consider this a good thing, as most signs seem to point towards Des as the knight. This number 1 spot wasn't surprising in all honesty, but come on guys, this really is the best knight theory, no matter how overrated or overstated it might be. 9.5 out of 10. And with all that said and done, it's time for my theory. Thanks for sticking around this long, by the way. You've gotten to hear the best theory in the video at this point. This is mainly just an extra bonus theory that I'm not too confident on, But the more I thought about this as a possibility, the more I realized it could work given the evidence we have, and the more interesting it could possibly make the story. Say hello to my personal theory, the Four Knights. This is the theory that the Roaring Knight is not just one person, but is actually a group of four specific people all working in collaboration towards the same goal: finding Des. I will discuss each person involved in the plan and why, who the creator of each fountain could possibly be, and what this might mean for the future of the game. I cannot conclude how long this group has been in collaboration. However, I can conclude that they remain in contact by means of their cell phones. We see Kris talking to a strange someone on the phone in Chapter 4. In accordance with the theory, I believe that Kris may have possibly been on the phone with more than one person. That's right, they're on a group chat. This can be supported in part by the fact that while and red text appears in the call, which can be interpreted as being from more than one person, and also some of the transitions don't go too well together, even though we can't really tell what words are being said due to not being able to hear the call well. The voice from the phone talks about dark fountains of police sacrifice, Kris's soul, and Susie with the guitar. The strange voice also reminds Kris of a promise they made at the end of Chapter 4. The voice also says, "I'll be right there," when called by Kris. This is followed shortly by Carol arriving at her house, which almost seems to reveal that the person on the phone is Carol. However, if she knows where the next fountain will be, how does she possibly have time to create the church fountains? Well, she didn't. Think about the fountains themselves, the characters that appear in them. Any red flags? Exactly. Mr. Oberon Smog himself, Gerson Boom. While Susie makes a dark fountain to look for Gerson, Ralsei tells her that darkeners made off of the dust of loved ones can only exist in specific darknesses. Notice that phrase, loved ones. This seems to imply that Gerson's existence had something to do with him being loved by its creator. Well, we don't know how many people really knew Gerson that well in life. Des or Carol could very well have known him. But who would have known him better than anyone? His son, Father Alvin. It is very possible that Alvin is the creator of both the fountains that appear in the church, as he undoubtedly would know his father better than anyone else and may have been trying to resurrect him. However, we never see Father Alvin in the Dark World or get any evidence towards him entering. The fountain was also made in the main room, not in Alvin's office, so the evidence is debatable. But what if Father Alvin was on the group call with Kris and Carol? The next fountain is mentioned, so what if Alvin was being told to make the fountain, or he told Kris and Carol where he would be making the next fountain? It would undoubtedly make some sense at least, since Alvin literally works at the church and could easily have made a fountain there, as that's where we saw him last. But what's the real motive behind making the fountain? Finding Des. Because Rudy takes Noelle to church, he almost definitely would take Des as well. And due to her ability to play music and possibly sing, she may have been a member of the church choir and could have possibly been close with Alvin. His motives towards finding Des could be tied towards getting her back, but they also could easily be in relation to the prophecy, as Alvin is probably the most religious man in hometown, I would hope. Obsessed with the angel and the prophecy. If he thought that finding Des would fulfill this prophecy, it would make perfect sense why he'd want to be a part of it. It is also conveniently mentioned by Caddy that the prophecy does not explicitly mention who the heroes are and don't know when they will exist, so it seems reasonable enough that Alvin could have falsely interpreted himself as one of the heroes, even if he's not involved as directly as the real heroes actually are. It also just so happens that one of the codes on the shelter door is represented by the Deltarune. And who is more affiliated with the Deltarune than Father Alvin? I've also heard theories that it's Toriel, seeing as the knight may have tried to take her in Chapter 3. But Toriel does not seem nearly as religious as a man like Alvin, so it may be that the knight with trying to take Toriel was just a red herring, and it was actually trying to take some sort of power from her. After Chapter 4, I'm sorry, but Toriel does not seem like the kind of person that would be affiliated with the night business secretly. Tying back into the door codes, I think that 3 of the 4 codes represent 3 of the 4 knights in some way. I've covered why I think Alvin is one of these 4 knights, but who are the other 3? Well, let's take a step back to Chapter 3 and look at Kris. Kris is the only knight that is not represented by the door. However, It seems extremely obvious that they would be involved in a plan like this. First, there's the phone calls, the fact that Carol welcomes Kris to her house strongly, and the whole ordeal with Chapter 3 in general. We know Kris made the fountain. That's not debatable. But why did they do it? Well, in Chapter 3, we get some evidence from Ram that Kris might have made the fountain to get closer to their freedom, which is why Ram wanted to possibly help Kris achieve this in some form. However, there's also evidence from Tenna himself. If you do the Chapter 3 Shadow Mantle sequence, an 8-bit version of Tenna describes to Kris part of his backstory, then asks them about their deal together and whether or not he performed well. Also, before Tenna's fight, he describes that when the Roaring Knight appeared, they made a deal together that if Tenna kept the three heroes busy, he could have all the viewers watch him that he wanted. Interestingly, it shows Tenna right as the fountain was first created. And who made it? You know who it is, Kris. I seriously doubt that the Knight had been in the Dark World that whole time, even at the beginning. So that begs the question, did Kris tell Tenna that they were the Knight? Yes. It almost seems like Kris's whole goal with making this fountain was to stall. Stall so something else could happen. I believe that Kris's goal in cooperation with the Roaring Knight business was to lure Undyne into the Dark World so she could be captured by Carol, who I believe is the Knight we see in chapters 3 and 4. The police sacrifice was clearly mentioned in a phone call in chapter 4, so it really does seem like capturing and sacrificing Undyne was part of the plan in bringing back Des, or at least accomplishing some goal that would eventually lead to her coming back. Kris may have been having fun on the way, but I think their true goal, deep down, was to stall their friends and get Undyne captured by Carol. Kris's seemingly strange and random plan actually seems to look extremely genius for them when you consider this theory. They may have also been given the plan by Carol in advance, as Kris does plug in the TV after the end of Chapter 1, seemingly in accordance with their plan for Chapter 3. It really does seem to me like Kris and Carol are the masterminds in this plan. Of course, the main motive for Kris joining the Roaring Knight effort was to find their friend, Des. Kris was likely involved in Des's initial appearance, as they clearly know the codes for the bunker, and Des's song, Raise Up Your Bat, also seems to hint at Des and Kris having been to the bunker together in the past. Carol might know this and is forcing Kris into helping find her daughter to make up for what they may have done in the bunker. There is something strange on the phone at the end of Chapter 4's Nomorant. Kris, don't forget, you promised. This could be Carol reminding Kris that now is not the time to back out on the Roaring Knight deal, despite the pain she willingly caused for them in Chapter 4 and the possible hatred they might have towards her at this point. Going back to the point I made earlier, I mentioned how Kris may have told Tenna that they were the Roaring Knight. Well, what if everyone involved in the Roaring Knight plan identifies as the Knight? This ties into my next theory. So, I've covered the deal with Alvin and Kris as Knights, and I've mentioned Carol as very clearly being one of the Knights, but who was the fourth? To put it simply, it's Asgore. Let me explain. We already know that Asgore lost his job as the chief of police through some conflict involving the disappearance of Des. It also resulted in his divorce and left him on the brink of financial ruin, being forced to sell flowers and clean houses to make ends meet. From a secret scene with Asgore in Chapter 4, we learn that Asgore somehow has a piece of the Knight's weapon, the Black Shard. It is very possible the shard was given to him by Carol, as according to this theory, Carol is the Knight we see in Chapters 3 and 4, and therefore wields a black knife, which could be the katana in her kitchen or the smaller sword in her bedroom. Since Asgore was in Carol's room when he had this shard, it seems likely to me he went into her room to take it. Asgore would absolutely be willing to do whatever it takes to find Des, as he seems to believe that doing it would bring Toriel back, as well as his job and his respect. This leads me to believe that the police sacrifice being described in the phone call may be geared towards getting rid of Undyne, so Asgore can take his place as the chief of police once again through morbid means. I believe that Asgore is likely to create the fountain with his shop in Chapter 5, given how he has a black shard, tells himself he needs to concentrate and let everyone see what really happened. While the police code on the door is likely information available to Undyne, because she has been to the shelter with Carol and was likely instructed to guard it during the night, the code may also be available to Asgore, as he was the former chief of police and likely plans to regain his status through means of Carol's shady plan. If the reason Kris made the fountain was to lure Undyne away from the shelter, this would also make sense towards other people going inside of it, such as Kris themselves, Asgore, or Carol. Although Carol, as the mayor, knew the code anyway and could enter any time, it is likely that she wanted Undyne out of the way so others could enter as well. Undyne would likely be very suspicious if Asgore or Kris tried to enter during the night. Now, let's go back to Asgore. Is Chapter 5 his first fountain, or did he make one before? Yes. I believe that Asgore is the creator of the Card Kingdom. Asgore is a large, burly man who could easily put the three kings in jail if he wanted to, and I believe that's exactly what he did. He was likely told by Carol to empower the most fearsome Darkener in the classroom to stop the heroes from sealing the fountain, and so he imprisoned three of the kings and left the Spade King in charge. It was obvious from the start that the Spade King and Asgore had parallels, and this would make a lot of sense as if Asgore was the creator of the Card Kingdom, as all dark fountains reflect the will of their creators, and the characters that appear in these fountains likely mirror the creator as well. If the Chaos King manifested from the evil side of Asgore, the side we were expecting in Undertale but never got to see, this would make a lot of sense. The question is, if Asgore knew that Kris was entering and sealing these fountains, why would he make one? Well, I don't think he knows. Either he has no idea that Kris is involved in the plan at all, or he simply has no idea that Kris is one of the heroes going through the Dark World and is only following Carol's plan. This could likely change drastically if Chapter 5, if Asgore learns that Kris is one of the heroes. It would possibly lead him to leaving the Death Rescue plan altogether. Well, you could argue that Asgore wouldn't let his adopted child get endangered by being part of this plan. He seems like a simple man with simple desires, so he might not truly realize the gravity of the situation he's in. There's also not enough evidence towards King having spoken directly with the knight to come to a conclusion about whether or not Asgore talked to him. I would guess not, as King is very surprised to hear that the heroes met the knight in Chapter 3 and even asked what they were like, as he had not actually spoken with them before. Now that we've covered who made the Card Kingdom, the TV world, and the Dark Sanctuaries, who made the Cyber World? I believe it's the only knight who I have not described as making a fountain yet, Carol. Queen describes the knight with long hands, which can also be interpreted as them having long arms. The knight, as we can see, has very long arms, so Carol making this fountain in her disguise would make sense. Now let's think about the Queen. Queen has been compared to Carol many times, and for good reason. Both people are overbearing towards Noelle and their people, and both seem to have a good relationship with Kris, as they are in cahoots with both characters. However, Queen accepts Noelle when she stands up to her, which is possibly not something Carol wants to see from her daughter. But the similarities between Queen and Carol cannot be denied, even if you don't buy the parallels between King and Asgore. This is why I believe Carol snuck into the library shortly before Noelle and Birdly arrived and made the Dark Fountain. However, it is still possible that Kris went to the library in the middle of the night and set up this plan to make a fountain by turning on the laptop. However, it seems more likely to me personally that Kris just wanted to eat the pie and plug in the TV. Now that I've described every knight involved in this plan, what counter evidence is there to discuss? Well, I've already talked about the situation with Asgore and Kris, which could easily be solved by him just not knowing Kris is involved, or not knowing they're one of the three heroes to seal the fountains. There's also the fact that Father Alvin warns Kris to stay away from the shelter. If he knew that Kris was involved in the plan, why would he say this? Well, it could be a similar situation with Asgore. Alvin is working with Carol, but does not know that Kris is working with her. This almost seems to set up a strange tree, with Carol being the stem of the tree and the other three knights being the branches without actually knowing the others are involved besides Carol. This would sort of disprove the group chat theory I presented earlier, but you could still interpret this conversation as Carol talking to Kris and no one else. She could have been telling them about the fountains that Father Alvin are about to make. I do believe this could lead to an interesting situation between all four knights, with them all believing they are the true Roaring Knight without knowing the others are involved. They're all working with Noelle Holiday, but they might not all be working with each other. And I think this could potentially lead to a falling out between all these characters and Carol, as she is setting up shady plans with all of these characters separately without telling them about each other's involvement. The first to drop the plan will probably be Father Alvin, as Susie wrote the old man's letter for him, which would cause him to have a change of heart about the situation. Asgore is next, as he will likely go to the Dark World with Kris in Chapter 5, realize they are one of the three heroes, and drop the night business completely. This just leaves Kris and Carol. It is possible that Kris themselves does not know about Asgore and Alvin making fountains, which could lead to a falling up between them and Carol once they realize what is really going on. Okay, so that's the whole theory. I don't know why I got super dramatic during that. I just thought it would make it funny. Overall, I find this theory of mine very interesting to think about, even if it's not particularly likely to be true. If I were to score my own theory, even if it's super based, I would give it a 3 out of 10, because while this was pretty fun to make, I don't by any means think it's a contender for Des and Carol. Please understand. Does it really matter who the knight is? No. All it matters is that the story of the knight ends up being pretty solid and their arc is carried out well. Feel free to DM me in Discord if you would like to discuss any of these theories with me, but I hope you enjoyed hearing me talk about these theories, especially the Four Knights theory since it's my own creation. See you in the next video. Hope you enjoyed.